Thank you very much, Dr. Brindle. As the Covey student representative, I would like to welcome everyone here tonight, and I would like to publicly thank Don and Elaine Triggs for this lecture series. As you're all well aware, tonight's keynote speaker is Dr. David Jordan. Dr. David Jordan is a well-known viticultural consultant with over 20 years' experience in the grape and wine industry. He established and is the principal consultant of Vine to Wine, which provides viticultural, winemaking, and wine business advice. He is based in Auckland with premium wine producing clients throughout New Zealand and Australia, as well as the Northern Hemisphere. He's been active in many industry groups, including the Working Party of the Sustainable Wine Grape Production Scheme. He is author of many practical and technical articles in local and international industry publications and a regular speaker at international conferences. Dr. Jordan has a doctorate in viticulture from Oregon State University and an honors degree in horticulture science from Lincoln University in New Zealand. Over the past few days, Dr. Jordan has led technical workshops and information sessions across Niagara at various vineyard sites. Approximately 80 growers, winemakers, students, and others from the Niagara wine industry attended these sessions. He discussed issues affecting our vineyards and how they, like other grape growing regions, are unique. He provided technical and practical information on many topics, including soil management and canopy management techniques such as pruning, shoot thinning, cluster thinning, leaf removal, hedging, and so on. Some important points were also addressed on sustainable vineyard practices, reducing vineyard variability to produce consistent and better quality wine grapes, and of course the importance of vine balance. Those who attended were able to have Q&A periods with Dr. Jordan to gain his insight on many issues ranging from winter injury prevention to the benefit of having lateral shoots to business aspects of the industry. This morning, students, faculty, and staff at Brock University were treated to a small information session on what is the business of growing grapes. Dr. Jordan explained the rise of the New Zealand wine industry, marketing, the logistics of growing grapes and operation costs, fruit quality and yield, and again, much discussion on vine balance and ways to achieve it. The underlying theme throughout was vine balance equals wine balance equals bank balance. During the past 2 days, students and those in the wine industry were given the opportunity to gain firsthand knowledge and expertise from Dr. Jordan. He encouraged growers to experiment on their own farms and told them they knew better than anybody how to grow and He encouraged growers to experiment on their farms and told them they knew better than anyone what would work in Niagara. He also told them to think like Kiwis and try anything to reduce problems such as winter injury. Dr. Jordan told a great story about one of his clients who ran compressed air through irrigation lines to raise the ambient temperature around the vines to 4 degrees to reduce frost damage. His practical knowledge gave students the ins and outs of viticulture and growing premium grapes not available from textbooks. I had the great experience to talk to Dr. Jordan about grape growing in Niagara in New Zealand, life as a grad student, and his feelings on some grape varieties that he thinks will work here, which I think he will discuss tonight. This evening, all of you will have the pleasure to listen to Dr. Jordan speak and learn from his expertise. His lecture is titled, "Could Niagara be the next New Zealand? Premium wine growing in a cool climate." It is with great pleasure that I present Dr. David Jordan.
That pleasure that I just heard Jim acknowledge and being able to introduce me, I also feel with some honour and pleasure to be the honoured nominee and then accepting the kind invitation to come and present to your industry my perspective on the successes or otherwise of New Zealand, and then trying to understand your industry and try with some hope and perhaps some dirty knees at times as I was down there trying to anticipate areas that you would benefit from this supposedly flightless Kiwi that found some wings and made it all this way to Ontario to experience, amongst other things, some wonderful hospitality, some very open and frank discussions, which I truly valued and I believe will benefit me in this presentation tonight. But also with great honour to be accepted as supposedly an eminent expert in the field of grape growing in a cool climate. So there are a lot of titles there that I hadn't realised that I would deserve. So it was very pleasant to hear those kind words, and thank you for the opportunity to come and present to you. Just as a little insight, over dinner there was open discussion on a range of topics, of which Donald Triggs asked one, and I said he needed to wait and stay attentive during my whole presentation to see this particular aspect develop. I see he couldn't wait to the end of my presentation and proceeded to work his way through my presentation as he was making his to get a sneak preview. So hopefully those who weren't reading too quickly and listened to the words of inspiration that came from Donald as he was talking about the importance of cohesion and the value of actually sharing an open discussion about various aspects of grape growing and the importance of it when it comes to the seeking and achieving that goal of producing premium wine. Now I realise, looking at my watch, and I'm on a different time zone, but I've got the correct one here. It looks like it's 10 to 8, thereabouts. It's pretty tough at this time of night to come out, and I suspect some of you came out because you may have seen there was a potential travel log and showing pretty pictures of New Zealand, which hopefully you're all aware of just how beautiful New Zealand is. And as a tourist, I encourage each and every one of you to come and visit and spend as many dollars as you have in your pocket on our tourist industry. But just to perhaps disappoint, but reassure you, if you do want to remind yourself of the beauty of the New Zealand wine industry, I'm going to leave with Kevin Kerr. There's some very colourful pictures and video clips of our industry, but there'll be very few pictures in my presentation tonight, because what I'd like to do is actually develop some thoughts, interestingly, that I started to create out of as limited but as extensive as I could, gathering information about your industry from my distant office down in New Zealand, trying to understand what happens in Niagara, what is the Ontario wine industry. So I gathered as much information I could prior to my departure from New Zealand, upon which I was leaving to the last minute, which was really upset Barbara, I think, as she was the sort of key coordinator in making this visit of mine work so seamlessly. I think she even sent a mercenary out to ask and check that, is there a PowerPoint presentation, because I think she feared that I was going to create it at the last minute. But my view was, based on my research prior to coming here and then taking the local colour through visiting vineyards and talking to people, that I'd make some changes. Intriguingly, some of my perceptions prior to coming here have just been endorsed largely, and hopefully I wasn't too biased through the work I did prior to coming here, through the discussions I've had. So hopefully we're going to deal with some sort of black and white elements of what I perceive as required to see your industry as successful as the New Zealand wine industry. And it was somewhat intrigued. I wondered why select a Kiwi to come and present this lecture series. And only today I grabbed two of your local publications, and many of you will be familiar with this, I think Vintages, and the other one is Vines. In the inside cover of, I think it's a recent September issue? No, September 3rd. So it's a recent release. The inside cover, Learning by the Glass, New Zealand's Sauvignon Blanc. You couldn't get much more dramatic for a tin pot little industry, as I tend to view it, on the pimple on the side of the international wine world, to get the significant profile that seems to be taken by your industry. And I quote here the details. It took the Kiwis to transform a herbaceous, minerally wine from France's Loire into a delicious worldwide favourite. I think there's some key words in there we'll come back to. Worldwide favourite. I think if we hang on those two words, I think there's some relevance for your industry as you may dwell on, can we say any of the wines here in Niagara, could you use the same terms? Worldwide favourite. In Vines, again, I think the summer issue, there's a client of mine has their wines in here, which is always, you get another sort of shiver as you go through and think, well done team. But here, Sacred Hill Wines with their Sauvignon Blanc. New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc hasn't lost any of its appeal with consumers, who have come to love the tropical mix of bracing acidity and bold herbal and tropical fruit flavours. Then it goes on, expect grapefruit, grassy aromas and flavours along with neat mix of flint, tropical fruit, peppery, smoky notes. I love the intensity and refreshment factor of this crisp white almost as much as I love the screw cap closure that means that I don't have to worry about corked wines. Those words and descriptions of our industry or products from our industry, really Niagara needs wines out in the world wine scene that could deservedly achieve same sort of accolades and attention. And hopefully through this presentation you'll see me come back to the importance of a couple of key parts, the worldwide consumer appeal of your wine and the importance of that. So in my presentation, and some of you might have done some speed reading earlier, the approach I was going to take is firstly look at why do we believe New Zealand has been success? What are the success drivers to our industry? And then you might want to do, as we go through this, just treat it as a bit of a checklist as you go through. As each line item comes up and we'll develop it with some detail, can you actually tick, yes, Niagara has it? And we'll come back to some of the areas that I believe Niagara needs to focus on to actually get it and have the foundations to achieve some success or similar success to perhaps what the New Zealand industry has done. And then for those of you that may desire to base information about the New Zealand grape growing in New Zealand, so you actually get a feel for the up and close and personal side of grape growing in New Zealand, so you don't go away with sort of a conceptual or more perception on your industry compared to ours, but some of the nuts and bolts associated with our grape growing. So firstly, I've sort of summarised here, and it's not necessarily to be a complete list, but some of the highlights of what I believe marks of the international or the success of the New Zealand wine industry. Firstly, and I think it's very important, there's international recognition for our wines. So you'll find, and I've only picked 2 of your publications locally, but if you go to any of the international wine press of the largest wine markets in the world, you'll find pretty much every edition there'll be some mention of New Zealand wine. So proportionally to the size of our industry, the coverage is far greater than its size. It's a bit of the David and Goliath concept. But at this point, David, and I guess that's maybe the other reason I got this job, the David in this case seems to be getting greater attention than its size. Can we say that about the Niagara industry? And part of that, I think, is that the wines do have and now are treated as international benchmarks. Frequently we see, particularly with New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, in any international tasting, our wines will be treated as the reference. It wasn't that long ago, it would have been wines from the Loire or areas of France that would have been referred to. It's more acidic, it's more flavoursome than a particular Sancerre or wines from that particular area of France. Now, repeatedly, we see the reverse happening. The French wines are compared to the aromatics and flavour development of our wines. The South Africans, the other countries are trying to emulate the Sauvignon Blanc characters and wine styles. The New Zealand wines are now treated as the benchmarks in that class. Again, are you sitting there thinking, could we say that about wine styles from Niagara? But underpinning this, we can be technically pure about the qualities of the wine, but unless there's somebody out there desiring to drink the wine, you might as well pack up your gear and go home. So almost against the response of many of our technical input, that the wines, the consumers love the vibrant drinkability of the styles that come out of New Zealand. So you do have to be aware and tuned into how the consumers perceive the wines that you produce. And if they're keen to buy it, you now create a business around it. And it's no point in being technically pure and producing a style that maybe, from all the right reasons, is a fantastic wine, but drinkability may have a lower rating. It's a little insight. If this room was full of New Zealand winemakers, and we can almost fill this room now, as you'll see, there's over 500 wineries, so we could have an individual member of those wineries represented here, and ask for a show of hands of those wineries, winemakers, who treat Sauvignon Blanc as their most desired wine style to drink. I'd venture that you'd struggle to find any of the winemakers put their hand up. If you ask the same question, would they desire to drink Pinot Noir or some other wine style, we'll now get a show of hands where, but intriguingly, so often the wines that may be not exciting our winemaking team in the way of a creation, consumers are falling over themselves to actually buy. So we have to be careful that sometimes the guidance for our future, our industry, the people in the best position to actually guide that industry may not be those with the technical skills. It may be being more receptive to the consumers, a better understanding of the market, and placing importance on consumer appeal and making sure the drinkability of the product you're making is very high. So looking further into the drivers of success or the marks of success, our wines receive a premium on pretty much every international market that our wines are sold. If you look at the UK market, it's the order of £1 higher than any other imported wine product into that market. So the second position in the imported wines in the UK market is £1 behind that of New Zealand average bottle price. It's a huge difference. And if you look at the product that we're selling, and normally if you were going to rate in the wine hierarchy, Sauvignon Blanc, which is our major product, would not feature in the price point. So you're dealing with a historically low price pointed wine. Now, on average, creating our industry is on average a high average bottle price. But we are securing and sustaining price premiums, which is important because it leads on to the ability to have every sector of our industry profitable. We can have dreams and aspirations and passion and romance about the desires of being in our industry, but when it all boils down, the sustainability is only created if we're seeing true profit in the sectors of our industry that make it work. So we need both the growers and particularly the wineries, particularly both sectors of our production line profitable. And with those successes, we're seeing a sustained growth, and out of that becomes a vibrancy that certainly fuels future development and the ongoing success. It's the old adage, success breeds success. So just as I've sort of broadly talked about the size and some aspects of the New Zealand wine industry. Our total production area is in the order of 20,000 hectares. And I apologise, I tend to think metrics, so those of you who think acres, you're going to have to do a few quick maths out here to times 2.475 to get a feel for the number of acres. But interesting just to get a sense of the rapid growth over the last 10 years, the area has grown from 6,000 hectares up to that 20,000 of producing vineyard. So it's in the order of 230% growth over a 10-year period. So it's nothing short of dramatic. The second sort of base understanding, the total tonnes crushed in the order of 142,000 tonnes this last vintage has just gone by. The previous year was in the order of 162,000, so just to give you a sense of the relative scale. And again, looking over the last 10 years, the growth has been approximately doubling the total volume from about 74,000 up to about that 140,000. In what has happened in that growth phase, there's been quite a maturity that's happened through the heady days of developing our industry. Every variety was planted in all regions of New Zealand, and predominantly the grape growing regions of New Zealand are along the east coast of both islands. Our major grape growing area is in this region of northeast of the South Island. Many of you probably recognise it from consuming some of our wines from Marlborough around the town of Blenheim. That area now represents about half of our total production. If we look back 10 years ago, you'd find it was the major areas were further to the north in Hawke's Bay around here, and then Gisborne in this area. So the industry has matured in understanding and playing to its strengths that the Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc was a very strong brand. The quality of the wines from that region were the ones that were gaining international recognition, and the growth in that region has underpinned the growth in our industry. Just so you put it in perspective, 35% of our planted area is Sauvignon Blanc, so it is a very important variety. The growth in this variety, though, has really occurred in very recent times, from 15% in '95 now up to that 35% now. And that growth's been over a relatively short time when you consider the traditional industry we work in. And basically 25 years ago, there were very few Sauvignon Blanc vineyards in New Zealand. So the ability to change and develop and get a new focus to an industry can happen very rapidly. Just as a wee bit of history, for any Scottish ancestors here, I feel quite at home. I'm in the Commonwealth, we're all together, but I'm not sure how many Scots. I heard a bagpipe playing a couple of days ago, so perhaps there are a few Scots around. But anyway, just a little snapshot of the history. In the mid-80s, our industry was in huge strife. Oversupplied, largely dependent on the domestic market, which was undergoing huge price gouging to secure sales for many of the significant wine companies, with bankruptcies, major issues in the grower level, and certainly we're in strife. The last sort of gesture of the generous government phase in our industry propped us up to aid the extraction of a significant part of the vineyard to enable the industry to restructure. From that point, and I just commented over lunch, the government has now proceeded to tax significantly our industry to regain the investment made in the early 80s or mid-80s. But interestingly, our industry has never looked back since that restructuring. So pulling out the low-value, low-performing vineyards and giving the capability to replant and restructure. Now if we move on, so we've seen the marks of success, the drivers to success, and I'll put these two words up here. It's a single variety. There's been a singular focus now of the importance of Sauvignon Blanc to our industry. It's been the export market developer. Taking that wine tends to open our export market doors as the first point of call. Once we get Sauvignon Blanc of our various producers introduced in the export market, it now gives us the ability to carry other product on the back of the success of the Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. So there is a focus on a variety that does very well in our industry. There are a number of varieties in the wings, those being Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and interestingly, there's large volumes of sparkling wine that are produced and have been successfully marketed internationally, which in many ways, all those varieties, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and sparkling wine, are all been swimming against the tide. If you look at the international trends and growth of varieties, the difficulties in marketing all of those products, New Zealand's been able to swim against the tide of the challenges in those markets. And why do I think that's occurred? I think it's occurred because in every case, to the best of our ability, we've tried to achieve international wine styles so that our markets can develop upon the appreciation of the wines. These wines tend to be unique in character, distinctive and appealing. And as long as those areas are delivered on, we get wine writers prepared to write about and take an interest in the products that we take to those markets. It's often initially not the consumers you need to worry about, but the gatekeepers to those markets that you need to influence. The wine writers, those are the buyers for the major retail chains, are the significant people, or the people that you have to influence to get any, to be entertained in any form for them to consider taking your product. And I think the other significant part of the success to our industry, we haven't tried to take on the breadth of the major varieties that you might name as being significant in the world wine trade, the Cabernet or the Bordeaux-based varieties. We tend to come down to the second level and try and make our mark in those varieties rather than take head-on the major varieties that some of our very competitive near neighbours, which you have to the south and we have to the west, that are very efficient producers of products like Cabernet-based wines. Other aspects that have created the success in New Zealand, firstly, we've been very effective at collective marketing. From an early stage, our industry has banded together to market our wines internationally, whether it be sharing booths at various international wine shows, taking our wines collectively to various releases, and whether it be in any and all our significant markets. And it's very rare to hear of a wine release that's done with a single New Zealand wine company. There is a very hectic and effective international program that wineries collectively attend to present recent releases of our wines. So, and in many of those cases, you'll find competing wine companies pouring their competitors' wines. So if I was representing a wine company, if my colleague couldn't attend the full time or any of the time, but they had their wines there, you'll often find what you would consider competing wine companies pouring their competitors' wine, and feeling and understanding the importance of actually portraying New Zealand as a wine industry and a collective, a cohesive force, rather than the individual brands necessarily being the strength. Rest assured, though, there's certainly a very competitive nature within the Kiwis, so they don't drop that completely, but certainly see the value in, and also the ability to spread a limited resource in developing markets. It's very hard to do on an individual company basis, but certainly collectively we get far better mileage out of the market spend that goes on. I think one other aspect, and it's always very hard, many of our traditional suppliers to the international markets have become quite tired. They got complacent, they put in strict regulations that often that contained and confined their ability to make change and adapt their wine styles to meet an ever-changing wine market. In our case, we're new to the game. We had a relatively short history, new entrants, didn't understand the word no. You can't do that, no. It only became a challenge. So that all, and I think that freshness was actually latched onto by many people rather than dealing with the third generation of a particular producer coming to the same port of call to introduce their wines. So I think that did enable us to gain some traction in many of our markets. And also, for many people that have visited New Zealand or were aware of those images that we spoke of earlier, there's a lot of positive support and images to the brand New Zealand. And that can come from the clean green climate to the personalities of the people behind the brand, the hospitality during visits. And there's a lot of similarities actually between the hospitality that I've experienced this week and what I hope that people experience when they visit New Zealand. So I think there's some similarities there. And all the way along, there is an attempt to ensure there's a profitable wine style to be made. And by focusing on a variety like Sauvignon Blanc, which typically is a high-yielding variety, the winemaking input is not extensive. It's a stainless steel, fermented, short duration, store time in wineries, and a quick turnover. There's some wine styles produced in New Zealand with Sauvignon Blanc that are less than 2 months from harvest to a commercial bottle in the marketplace. And if any of you have done your sums on operating your winery, you quickly understand the cost of holding stock. Also, some of the payment structures for growers, some of those wineries are receiving payment for their wine before they've completed full payment for the growers. So if you think from a cash flow point of view, it makes the industry look very appealing compared to many of the more traditional wine styles that require barrel aging, all the expense and handling of that, and the duration of holding that stock before you've actually got a saleable product. I'd really endorse you to fully embrace wine styles that have a lot lower cost structure and a quicker turnover, so shortening the time from harvest through to market. Because if you can get the cost structure right and the margin in the product, there's some real cash flow benefits to your business, and it enables the growth of your business to be funded. The other aspect of our industry, and I think many would probably see this as a negative, but I think it's actually turned around to be a real positive. Our wines effectively only have a 12-month selling proposition because the current release is the one that we focus on. I have a winemaking colleague in New Zealand. He talks about aged Sauvignon Blanc as like stale bread. And so we quickly ensure that the market is focusing on the current release because it plays into the vibrancy of a recent release Sauvignon Blanc. As Sauvignon Blanc ages, the characters aren't always appealing. It's not a wine that necessarily benefits with a lot of aging. So we've now got ourselves, and potentially there's some issues with this, but we've got ourselves into a more rapid turnover and focusing on the current release rather than the benefits of aging. And we were discussing over dinner, there is a fair bit of information around that supports the fact that most wine that is purchased, and I've heard figures in the order of upwards of 99% of all bottles that are purchased are consumed within an hour of that purchase time. And the figure was debated whether it was 1% or 3%. But we're talking about a wine that actually is cellared. So if you start appreciating the market is actually more for ready drink styles that or are ready to drink once you take the closure off that bottle, rather than actually the desire that we're making wines for cellaring, because we tend to only be catering to a very small part of the market. One of the other aspects is by pitching out a product that we can actually grow very efficiently. It's relatively cheap to produce because stainless steel and storage is relatively cheap, lower winemaking inputs. We're able to take a reasonably significant volumes of this style into the world wine market at a relatively affordable price and still hold and build a margin into the product. In contrast, if it was a wine that received a lot of barrel aging, we'd already built a lot of costs, we immediately move up the price point scales, and you'll all be aware of the sensitivity of purchase of wine to price point. So if you're in the barrel age, you're already at a cost structure, you have to start higher in the price point division. And by default, then the amount of wine you can sell will be less, and also the competition of those sectors tend to be extremely fierce. A lot of companies and countries are trying to secure points higher in the price point strata to build premiums into their product, and you find a lot of people fighting for that sector. We're enabled to go into a lower point where larger volumes are traded and provide a viable and rewarding option for consumers. And as I said, part of that is also focusing on this turnover of the current vintage. If we look a bit further into the production team, I believe Kiwis inherently have an innovation and an innovative style. And if you look at the globe, you probably understand somewhere as isolated as New Zealand, you don't get a lot of support in your near vicinity. You know, if it's, so you tend to have to be quite resourceful, and out of that comes the innovation that is often attributed to many Kiwis. And as you work within vineyards and in wineries, you'll see many forms of innovation and also the preparedness and how early are prepared to adopt. A colleague of mine has just introduced a new form of wine technology. It's developed in Australia, and he's just recently introduced it to New Zealand. He said, I don't believe the difference in New Zealand. He's worked in both countries for many years. He said, until I bought this technology and compared the introduction in Australia, where we'd go into a wine company, introduce it, and they'd show how it works, the wine company would be very insular. The technical staff would all gather around, learn about the technology, see its benefit, and discuss it internally. The same event in New Zealand, my colleague would take the technology into a winery, and he'd look around, and all these the winemaker of that winery would have invited all his mates from the neighbouring wineries to come in and have a look at this technology. There was an open discussion between what you would again believe to be competing wine companies, are all there talking within a competitor's winery about the pros and cons of this technology. There was an openness and a discussion to share information, and through that, I believe there's an ability to keep advancing how our industry particularly produces the wines. There are many technical workshops where wineries will present. Pinot Noir is a classic, where the current releases of wineries will bring their current releases prior to release, so pre-release, and they'll openly, 60 of them will gather annually to show their wines to their colleagues. And they'll pour each other's wines, talk about the wines, and through that process, progressively improve the collective performance of that sector of our industry. Can you say that about your industry? Do you have your winemakers gathering prior to release their wines, having a discussion about the pros and cons of each other's Riesling, for example? One other thing that we've quickly moved on to is not being ashamed that we don't have to copy somebody else. Our wines don't need to look like imitations of the region of France that Sauvignon Blanc is renowned for. We're now quite comfortable that our wines can be unique, so we don't have to look to reproduce a direct copy. So enabling some comfort in the development of uniqueness as a point of being distinctive and so recognisable in blind tastings, for example. Along the way, we need to ensure that as best we can, and there are vagaries in the weather, and it's always challenging, but as best we can, ensure that our wines are as consistent in their quality. It's very rare, in fact, almost unheard of, to have any negative comment made about a New Zealand vintage. It'll be described in difference intensity or character, rather than saying, "Oh, 95, that was a tough year," or trying to talk down. There's an understanding that one piece of negative news takes 10 pieces of positive news to counter. So it's easy actually to not disseminate anything negative about a vintage release to ensure that you've got you can take the spotlight off some difficulties that may have occurred. And the consistent quality has been supported through initiatives primarily through an export certification process where wines are both analytically investigated and also through a sensory evaluation to ensure that wines don't leave our shores that have any particular outlying faults or clear faults or issues, and to enable that as best we can that the integrity of our product is withheld, which is in a similar vein to your VQA. And as another development, and it's the continual improvement of our industry, is that of a development of an environmental integrity program, which had its origins within the vineyard, developing a scorecard that helped guide our growers towards a pathway of improvement to try and protect the environment and the safety of the product that they were producing, that is the grapes. And now we have in excess of 50% of our vineyard participating as members of that scheme, with the common goal to try and ensure that the environment in which the vineyards are located is protected as best we can. That scheme now is extended to wineries, and so the whole industry is embracing the concept of sustainability when it comes to environmental issues. Another, probably in the analysis of why New Zealand has done well, we have the benefit of being able to release a vintage in the same calendar year as we've picked the grapes. Fortunately, the 05 vintage for us is already in the market. We picked it back in February, April, March of this year, which puts the Southern Hemisphere in quite a unique position when it comes to working in the Northern Hemisphere and supplying wine. Our 05s are already in your market, or getting close to arriving. They will be here, which your 05s have just been picked. And I wonder whether at times that sequence of our release pattern has actually worked to our advantage, in the sort of vibrancy and release has given us a unique position. And just so that we don't forget the vineyards have played a part, we've been very fortunate that the match of Sauvignon Blanc with the growing environment of Marlborough, which is it wasn't through any conscious determination. It was really one of those lucky events that by planting the Triggs varieties in Marlborough, out came the vibrancy of Sauvignon Blanc and showed just the potential of that variety in that region. And it's proved to be unique and very hard to reproduce anywhere else, and we've been able to play to that strength. So I don't know, those of you that have been going through the presentation just thinking, well, and checking off, how does Niagara compare? I wonder whether we just go through, and based on some of my observations, how does Niagara compare? Firstly, the question is, where is your Sauvignon Blanc? Where is your variety that's really going to set this region on the international, put the international spotlight on this region? Just thinking of the varieties and trying to understand what you've got planted here and your ability to change. I've quickly worked back through and the data that I could obtain from in 1991. I see in your region the top 3 varieties were firstly Vidal, Sauvignon Blanc and Niagara. So on the international scene, you probably have some handicap there, I'd say. At the same time, New Zealand also was in a wheelchair. It was wheeling itself around with a couple of broken legs, with Muller, Turgau, Muscat, and fortunately there's a bit of a glimmer of hope. There was Chardonnay tucked in the as a poor third. Now if we look, and I'm sorry I couldn't get any more recent data, and perhaps I could have updated this week, but you probably can do this in your mind. In 01, from the data I could see in Niagara, there has been a shift. Chardonnay has come through from not being in the top 3 in 91, so over 10 years has moved to number 1. Vidal is hanging in there, is number 2, and Cabernet Franc has come from nowhere to the 3rd position. New Zealand over that same time, the 3 varieties that we saw before, Muller, Turgau, Muscat, Chardonnay, we now see Sauvignon Blanc has come from nowhere to be definitely top of the pops, with Pinot Noir and Chardonnay a close second, and they're quite a distant, but Chardonnay and Pinot Noir of a similar planted area. So there's been quite a dramatic change in a very short time in New Zealand. I'm seeing a slower change in the varietal mix here in Niagara. And I wonder whether part of that is, have you truly recognised what your Sauvignon Blanc or equivalent wine style is going to be? What is going to be your flag bearer to take you in to give you the focus for change? So it leads on to, where is your point of difference? And the variety, this is extremely tough, and we discussed this morning. Out of the 3,000 or so varieties you could go through and evaluate, and it really comes down to a very short list. The market is traditional. It is tough to introduce any new wines into. I think it's particularly tough in what I've termed the king and queen varieties, those traditional large volume varieties. And as a smaller region, I think you don't want to play with the big boys. You want to be in the next tier, identifying the varieties that work well for you and your region. And I discussed over the last day and a half the evaluation process, and it depends on your perspective. You either start from the market end or from the production end. I'm a production person, so I'll start from the production end. You need to look at varieties that grow well in your climate, and that'll be a short list. And from what I've learned this week, it is a relatively short list of varieties that perform well, that grow consistently and produce a quality fruit. Out of that short list, some of those make superior wines than others in that list. Those that produce superior wines are where your focus should be. And then the final layer is which of now the superior wines that you can make have some market appeal and long-term sustainability in any of the markets. If you go through those three layers and get a tick, yes, it grows well, yes, we can make good wine, and yes, it will sell well, now we put focus on to what variety could grow in this area. And I'd have to say, in the wines that I've tried and looking in the vineyards, Riesling must be the variety that stands out as the opportunity for you. And it poses its own challenges to develop a market of the sustainability that I said that you require. But looking at the vineyards, there's some really impressive vineyards of Riesling I've seen. I've tried some internationally high quality Riesling styles in my limited inebriated state during the latter parts of the last 3 days, and remember what I've tried. Like tonight was a classic, another Riesling that just stood out in the lineup of wines that we tried. And as we've developed this sort of thought, because others have been asking me what are my perceptions of the varieties, and it's been openly discussed, so I've received input from members of your industry. It's pointed out quite rightly, you have the flexibility with Riesling to make a range of wine styles. But I think we get the first two boxes checked quite quickly. It grows well, we can make great wines. Now becomes the challenge in the market. Riesling, unfortunately, has suffered from past performance, and particularly the German suppliers, and it's damaged really the perception of Riesling. So there's some ground to be made in educating people back towards Riesling. Many wine writers have prophesied the return of Riesling. As we joked earlier, perhaps we need a sideways movie with Riesling as the focus rather than Pinot Noir confused with Cabernet Franc, as the movie tend to portray. But we need to look at for some inspiration that takes Riesling away from the reputation of other producers. The other factor, and this may be a personal one and something that you perhaps may understand, I find, and many of my drunken mates tend to think Riesling is a style that we wouldn't take to the dinner table. So in contrast to, say, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc gets a fair way, but it's not necessarily a universal wine style for a range of food styles. Riesling, I think, has some challenges to be the ultimate food wine. So I think in part of a marketing initiative that I would develop for this industry would be quickly ensuring that you provide a range of food options that go well with the Riesling wine styles that you produce here. So that you see your wines not be seen as an aperitif or a post-meal product, but something that can be consumed when most, particularly during the introduction phase to wine consumption, is during the meal. So there, I think there are certainly some challenges, but I'm sure there are definitely opportunities. So in part of identifying this point of difference, it's certainly you need to ensure that your wines are distinctly different. In a comparative tasting, do your wines consistently stand out from others that produce the same style? And I think from what I've seen in the limited Rieslings I've looked at, there's certainly an opportunity for that to be the case. And then as you pour your first glass of wine to some of those gatekeepers I talked about, all the consumers, is there instant appeal in the wine that you've poured in their glass? And unless your wine styles are achieving that, there's going to be a difficulty in developing the sort of new phase and development of your industry. And we can't forget the commercial reality. So along the way, and we're identifying perhaps this Riesling has this opportunity. can we produce the wine style in a way that would sustain real profits to the sectors of your industry? Is there a sales future of the potential volume that you can produce from your region? As long as we're avoiding the square peg round hole, because it's a very awkward position if you've taken those first 2 points, you've grown the fruit well, you've made the wines well. If you start sensing you're trying to force this product upon the market as if you're a square peg going into that round hole, you want to recognise that and make sure that you've adjusted your focus. And along the way, keep reminding yourself of your strengths, and that's your focus. Play to those. Don't be too open with any weaknesses you believe you may have, but keep reminding yourself of the strengths, and that from that tends to provide the focus to your business. Now, this next part is something that I'm very adamant that if you think about the dynamic in New Zealand, we're only a population of near on 4 million people. The volume of wine that I showed up earlier, we have to be an extremely thirsty nation to consume all the wine that we produce. So we've been forced into understanding we need an export focus to our industry. So it's a case of necessity. I think there's also a real benefit of having our wines under international exposure. It's created the opportunity for our wine styles to progress through the competition associated with marketing our wines internationally. I share a fear, or I have a fear that while your industry focuses on the domestic market, and I understand a lot of imported wines come into that market, you run the risk of not benefiting from the exposure of the international marketplace, and also the profile that can come out of international success. There is quite a spin-off for wine companies in New Zealand that achieve success for their wines in whether the UK, US or other markets back in the domestic market. So don't deny yourself the opportunity for your wines to experience scrutiny in the international marketplace, hopefully receive accolades and rewards that you can then use to benefit your wine style, broaden your market, and also improve the profile of your wines in the domestic market here. Obviously, with an export focus, our wine markets are quite diverse. Here I'm hearing largely the distance from market from here in Niagara, it's largely to Toronto and back. There's, you put a blanket over that being your local market. Some market diversity, I think, is very important to, again, hone some of these more driven approaches to fine-tuning and improving your business. The figures I could see, just for comparison, it appears that wines from the Niagara region, only about 3% are exported. And somebody might correct me, but I doubt whether it's going to compare to the 53% that we export in the New Zealand market, or from the New Zealand industry. I want to come back to consistency. The growers in the vineyards yesterday heard me hammer home the concept of uniformity, getting consistent performance of vines, between years, within the vine. And I think as an industry, we need to strive here for the Niagara wines to be consistent from one year to the next. I was somewhat shocked when I was gathering information on your industry to see open documents with easy access declaring failures of particular years from your industry. It was black and white. They were failures. They were low. What was the term that was used here? They were off years, I think the term was. So I couldn't tell because it was off in flavour, off in volume, which I subsequently discovered is probably what was being referred to. But it was in some of your industry publications that I was able to obtain. You survey the New Zealand industry and find an industry document that comments about troublesome vintages. I challenge you to find it. You're certainly understanding some years are better than others, but the concept that one is off, it's certainly not entertained. Every year has to be good in today's market. Memories are short, or memories are long actually, when it comes to consumers that get burnt on a bad vintage. So you need to ensure that every release that you make will hold the consumers, your loyal consumers, that will continue to buy your product. And that's through achieving as best you can consistency in the quality of your product. One thing I read with interest, and it was maybe a somewhat dated, but a summary of the Wines of Ontario sales and marketing plan And I thought most of your industry, if they had any reading time, would only read the summary in this. And I saw the critical success factors, and one that I read through, and there must be a statement in here about wine quality. So I read through, and the nearest thing I could get in the summary of this document was, have faith, hallelujah, in the power and potential of Ontario wines as a brand. And sorry, I could see the marketing department or the marketing people had huge influence on this document, but there was no mention of the underpinning importance of wine quality from this region. The importance of having your wines internationally recognised. As I said, there was no mention of the importance of wine quality, and I would have thought that would have been so pivotal to the success. So that was probably a wee bit more hard-hitting than maybe you would expect it from a... I'm leaving tomorrow, so I can sort of get out of the country before I take too many daggers with me. And apparently the metal detector will pick them up as I go through anyway. So what I see is some of the strengths of your region. Firstly, it's relatively small scale, so you should be in a position to move very quickly, to adapt, to be further progress your industry. I wonder though, prior to after preparing this presentation, I sense there's actually some constraints that change. You have some distorting factors about why your industry would be slower to change. I think the collective marketing for your fruit price, and I know it's quite a thorny and political issue, I would suspect it's actually detaching the market information back to you as growers to understand which varieties are the ones you should be focusing on. You may wonder, why did the New Zealand industry change so rapidly? It was through the open market process that wineries didn't want to buy Muller Turgau. They were prepared to pay $2,500 New Zealand dollars a tonne for Sauvignon Blanc. At the same time, they were out of sufferance, spend $500 a tonne on Muller Turgau. The relative yields of those two varieties, Sauvignon Blanc was superior. So you can easily do the sums on the revenue impact for the grower. There was no future to continue to grow Muller Turgau. But are you receiving the same market indications through the fruit pricing arrangement here to truly understand which varieties you should be focusing on? And unfortunately, the sympathetic side of me says, there's some pain associated with the change. Some growers will feel, their margins, their profit will be dramatically impacted if the prices truly reflected the long-term market appeal of the fruit that they were growing, if they were aligned with one that doesn't have long-term success. Continue to look at the strengths of this area. I think you've got a unique climate, soil, location. Treat that as a strength. Make sure those aspects are reflected in the wine styles so that you do have a unique proposition to take to your market. There are elements of cohesion, and I see that in some of the marketing initiatives from your region. I wonder now, in better understanding your industry, whether the cohesion is as extensive as it could be for the long-term success. I like the phrase, poised for greatness. I read Donald Triggs sort of comments about he's a patient man because he's invested in the wine industry. I think today's wine industry, you can't be patient for too long. Patient could also be termed complacent in the way that we can put off change. I think change, if you believe in it, will have to occur quite quickly to secure the long-term success of your industry. And I take heart that the varietal mix is improving. So there is change happening. The increased significance of vinifera varieties, and hence I guess the title of this lecture series, is occurring. But we need to now get that next level of maturity in this region of identifying within the vinifera varieties which ones we should be focusing on, and that needs to happen quickly. I think a strength of your industry is the VQA, which certainly has adds substance and to the importance of quality of wines produced from this region, and provides a framework to ensure integrity of the product. And it appears to be an important part of the long-term future of your industry. But I ask the question, does this process ensure that the wines are technically sound or are commercially appealing? Because sometimes technically driven evaluations tend to not always identify the wines with most consumer appeal. And as long as you're confident that the process creates wines with consumer appeal, the approach of having something like the VQA is very important for the long-term quality or the importance of long-term quality, performance and consistency. I take heart in seeing there's an environmental leadership initiative in this region. I think that will play an increasingly important part for the future of your industry. Where do I believe there are still areas for you to work on? I think you need to identify where your great white knight is. What is going to be your flag-bearing variety that you can actually ride into the future on? Your only opportunity is to be a niche player in any market that you identify that you have an opportunity in. So as a niche player, you need to move, be flexible and have the characteristics of a niche player. Don't believe you can take on the world with the muscle of some of the larger companies, even though I realise you have one very significant wine company in your region. Most of you, though, will have to take the niche approach for your success. And finally, I believe we need to ensure that the wine styles here do have international appeal and are recognised as such. Back one. Just quickly, in the few minutes I've got left, I'm going to move on now from all that more political and conceptual sort of review of what I believe our industry was at and how it succeeded, and my observations of your industry and perhaps avenues and opportunities. And I'm sure for some of you it was repeating something you already knew, and hopefully just endorses you and give you confidence to go forward on those. Just quickly to get inside a New Zealand vineyard, I've termed the nuts, bolts and vines of our vineyards, and it's really just a snapshot so you get a sense of it. Firstly, most of our vineyards are on flat river terraces, very few hill or sloping vineyards. Most of the soils are stony gravels, which are quite variable and do pose some challenges for our varieties to grow in there. But interestingly, Sauvignon Blanc is one of the few varieties that actually benefits from some variability within the vineyard to get a spectrum of flavours. All our vineyards, any recent vineyards, are all grafted because of the presence of phylloxera, and we intriguingly only have one clone of Sauvignon Blanc that dominates our industry, which is relatively unique if you look at other varieties, the importance of clonal diversity. Sauvignon Blanc, we've been able to get away with the diversity that's been created within that clone through site variation. Pretty much all our vineyards are vertical shoot position. The standard row spacing is anything between 2.4 and 3 metres, with the vine spacing in the order of 1.8 to 2 metres between the vines. So there's certainly some differences there compared to the vineyards I've been observing locally. Just so you appreciate the cost structure in New Zealand and do the comparison again in hectares, and these are, as best I can, Canadian dollars rather than New Zealand dollars. So in the order of 70,000 Canadian dollars per hectare to buy bare land in Marlborough. The vineyard to establish in the order of 43,000 through to the end of year 3. So I think both of those figures are sort of censor in alignment with the figures to establish a vineyard in your region here. Our operating costs, again, I think are very similar to growing grapes in Niagara, about $7,500 to $8,000 per hectare. If you hold that figure of $7,500 a hectare and then look at the revenue side of growing grapes, and I'm really focusing on Marlborough here, Sauvignon Blanc this year, the average price per tonne was $1,900 a tonne. Pinot Noir over $2,000, that's come back a bit recently. Chardonnay in the order of $1,700 a tonne. So I'm sure some of the growers in the audience here are comparing to their own prices. Then to actually understand the revenue, oh, hang on, I missed a step. If I go back. Somewhere in there I thought there was a slide talking about the yields. I'll just trot them off the top of my head so you can do the revenue calculation here now. Sauvignon Blanc would be in the order, the range is from 10 to 20 tonne to the hectare. I kept it nice round figures so you can do the sums in your head. So 10 times 19, $19,000 a hectare. Operating costs, 7.5. So that's the low end. Now you've got the margin of growing grapes in New Zealand. When the yield gets closer to 20 tonne to the hectare, most of the growers can be found in the island somewhere, sunning themselves on the beach, spending the spoils of their profits of growing grapes. Pinot Noir, the yields, we'll see later, I'm sure we'll find the slide, is more in the order of 5 to 9 tonne to the hectare. Chardonnay more like 8 to 14 tonne to the hectare. So the yields are lower, the return per hectare, the focus for a grower, and we see this in Marlborough. There was a great enthusiasm for planting lots of Pinot Noir. That lasted for about a year. Many of those Pinot Noir vineyards have now been grafted over to Sauvignon Blanc because the growers quickly appreciate just the margin, the profitability in growing Sauvignon Blanc, and at this point have been unable to satisfy the demand of wineries, and consequently the price has been sustained at that $1,900 a tonne for the last 4 to 5 years. Just another insight to how we manage our vines. Largely they're cane prune vines, Sauvignon Blanc typically 4 canes, Pinot Noir 2, and there's an increasing interest in spur pruning of Pinot Noir. Basic canopy work is not that dissimilar to the VSP or canopies I observed in your region. We do some shoot thinning, particularly around the heads of the vines, and there may be along the canes of the particularly higher price and demanding varieties like Pinot Noir. We do various levels of leaf plucking, but relatively mild to moderate, wire lift to position the shoots, and we typically trim our canopies 2 to 3 times. Our disease issues are pretty international, powdery mildew and botrytis being the 2 major diseases that we have to deal with. And the list gets quite short after that. As for insect pests, there's a grass scrub pasture beetle, bronze beetle, that flies in our spring period that can defoliate vines. There's a few areas in New Zealand that have mealybug, but other than that, there are no insect pests that really cause us any problems. The application of insecticide is quite rare in our industry. Climatic issues, we have some. I've been grappling with your winter injury that you've experienced here, and there's certainly a sympathetic ear as I've been trying to understand the challenges you have with that. We have our own, maybe not as dramatic as what you've experienced here in recent times, but certainly spring frosts can completely obliterate a vineyard. And we've had repeated experiences of total crop loss with spring frosts. And often it can be points where the shoots are at this length. So it's not just as the buds are developing, we've got substantial growth before the frost may have occurred. And we go about quite expensive methods of frost fighting with either helicopters. As a little aside, New Zealand has the highest per capita number of helicopters in the world. So we have access to a number of these, but there's actually quite a lot of competition for them. The tourists will want to fly and ski from them. The kiwifruit industry also uses them for frost fighting, and things like Rally of New Zealand and a few others, where we have pilots that are flying almost 24 hours a day as they fly during the daylight filming the rally cars, and then fly during the night protecting vineyards or orchards. So the main reason for a lot of helicopters is really around deer recovery and other activities for helicopters. So one of those quirky facts, we also, the corollary of the high number of helicopters, we also have the highest number of helicopter incidences in the world, or accidents. It probably follows. The other part of cool springs associated with frost is we often get cool flowering conditions which will affect the set. So we do see reasonably violent swings from one year to the next in crop load, not through any sort of human influence other than the impact of cool conditions while the vines are flowering. So we can see quite dramatic fruit set effects because of that. And then at the other end, we tend to get autumn rains that provide the challenges associated with botrytis and fruit integrity, and can set the harvest decisions in quite a rapid sequence of trying to get the fruit off. And we are in a windy country, and that does pose its own challenges. We do irrigate our vines. Most of the vineyards you'll find will have lateral lines providing trickle irrigation along the rows. But it's now interesting to note that we found it's extremely important for wine styles like Sauvignon Blanc. The aromatic varieties that we don't tolerate, and found it's to the disadvantage of our wine styles that the vines experience any form of water stress. In fact, you're better off to err on the other end of being slightly heavy-handed in your water application to secure the wine styles, to have the vibrancy, the zip, the zing associated with our wine styles. Most of the water we source from underground, so either bores or wells, but interesting, with the increased demand because of the expansion of our industry, that water resource is starting to become limiting. We're looking at alternative methods of primarily winter harvesting of the rainfall that occurs during the winter, which most often arrives out in the ocean somewhere. Here's the slide I was looking for before, so we can skip over. It's just repeating the yields of the various varieties, the Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and I think I remembered all those. It's impressive. And some of those varieties we have to apply yield control to ensure that the yield quality relationship stays within the framework that makes our winemaking team excited. Pinot Noir particularly is one that's very sensitive to yield, overcropping, reducing the quality of that variety. So we will get out and drop the crop. Breaks most growers' hearts. As for harvesting, about I'd say 99% of all the fruit in New Zealand is mechanically harvested. We do hand harvest small portions of particularly the Pinot Noir, some Chardonnay that's whole bunch pressed, and then sparkling wine base is often that's hand harvested for the premium end, although the large volumes of sparkling wine that we sell around the world, a lot of it is machine harvested. Getting towards the end of my presentation so you can start breathing again, just as a small advertisement, as I said before, I encourage you all to visit as tourists to New Zealand. If you want to make it as a business expense, you can come to the Cool Climate Symposium, which typically has been held every 4 years, although there's been a 6-year gap between the last Cool Climate Symposium held in Melbourne in 2000. The next Cool Climate Symposium, a week-long event, is being held in Christchurch in the South Island in February next year. And everybody tells me February's a good time to leave Niagara. So if you're looking for an excuse that your tax department, you can justify at every turn, I've got some brochures for the conference down here in front. You feel welcome to take information about the conference or check the website out. Look forward to seeing everybody. So just to conclude my presentation, if we quickly go back and think about New Zealand's success and what they are, I think that comes through the focus on a variety that really is a strength we identified as being a strength and a unique proposition that we could take to the world. Our wines have been internationally recognised, and we've been able to support those wines in developing brand New Zealand and brand Marlborough. The vineyards have relatively simple practices, nothing too dramatic in there. Pretty much our practices allow site expression to come through, so our wines do have a unique signature. And we've been fortunate, we've been able to sustain profitability in the production sectors. Thinking back to your own region, I think Niagara has to focus on what its points of difference really are. You do need to identify your so-called Great White Knight. What is that variety? And if it's Riesling, get down and focus on it. And part of that is understanding, in my view, the importance of international recognition for that style. And I challenge you to actually value the role of exporting your product to improve your exposure to competition and the ability to have spin-off benefit both back in your domestic market and the evolution of your wine styles. So with that, hopefully kept a few eyelids open. So congratulations. I've awarded medals throughout the last 2 days for those that sustained 8 hours of me presenting in the field and stayed right to the end. Then showed again this morning for the presentation. I see some familiar faces again tonight, so you're up to 3 medals. So well done, and all the best with this vintage and the ongoing success of your industry.